Hey friends, welcome to the channel. Today in this video we are going to solve the final problem of week 9 of CS50, which is finance.
Hey, this is me from the future. Now, while solving this problem set, there have been multiple instances when I have made some mistakes, but later in the video I have fixed it. So since this is the hardest problem of CS50, do not skip any portion of it. Watch the entire video so that you don't miss anything. And if you were to follow the entire video properly, slowly, and pause the video if needed. If you follow everything properly, you will get full point for your style and for the logic, because I did get it. I'm from the future. If you see outside, it's evening right now. I started this video in kind of like afternoon, right? So watch the full video. Let's get back in.
So to see the requirements, the very first thing that we'll do is we'll come to this particular website, which is cs50.harvard.edu/x/2025/PSets/9. If you're watching this video in 26, make sure to change the year, right? Make it 26 here. Once you're here, click on finance, which is the problem that we're going to solve. And once you come down, once you see everything, what you will recognize is we have to basically build a full stack application, which is basically a stock trading kind of website, right? This is going to be the portfolio of the user, whoever signs in. This is one of the hardest problem, I'd say, of CS50. So without wasting any time, let's jump right in. The very first thing that we'll do is, on the left, we'll click on Visual Studio Code, control click or command click to open it in a new tab, which I did already. And once you're here, click on log in with your GitHub account, and we'll give it a second to load. After it has loaded, this is the interface that you'll see. If you've been following my videos, you will know that we are keeping everything organized. So on the left we have week 9, right? So in the terminal you will say cd week 9, and we'll navigate into that, ls to list everything. So as of now we just have one directory called birthdays, right? And now if you come back here, we have a distribution code that is given. So under getting started, the second command, we'll copy this entire line which has finance.zip. We'll come here and we'll paste the command, and that will give us a finance.zip file. So we will unzip that. To do that, I'll say unzip finance.zip and press enter. That will give us a folder called finance. So I'll get rid of the .zip file because we don't need that anymore. So I'll say rm finance.zip, press enter. Are you sure? Yes, I am. And now if we do ls, we have a finance directory also. So I'll navigate into that directory by saying change directory to finance, ls. So these are the files and folders that we have inside finance. Now there are two major things that we have to keep in mind. The first is we are going to primarily work with app.py, and the second thing is we have to create multiple .html files, right? And the files that we have to create will be proportionate, if we go down, to all the specifications that is given. So we will start with the easiest, which is going to be register, right? So the very first thing that we will do is we will create a new .html file called register.html, right? And then before we do anything, let's also run Flask so that we can see what we are working with. And if we give it a second by saying, after saying flask run, it will give us a link to preview the file that we are working with, or basically the website that we are working with. So I'll command click to open it in a new tab. And if we give it a second, okay, this is what we are working with right now. If I click on register at this moment, nothing will happen because this is something that we have to do, right? So I'll go back, and on the left, let's go to register.html, which is currently the file that we have to work in. And most of the part of register.html is going to be similar to this, right? Which is basically login.html. So what I'll do is I'll copy all of this. I'll go to register.html. I'll paste it, right? And here I will change the title as in the title of the HTML file, and I'll call it register, right? Similarly, after we have done this button right now says login. I'll make it register. And once we have this, we have to add one other thing. So right now if I say register, it still won't work because we have not connected it. But what we will realize after reading the description of register is we have to have a confirm password section also. So right now we have something called username, and then we have, hold on, let me get rid of the side panel so that you can see everything properly. So right now we have username and password, which is just copied and pasted from login.html. What we also have to do is we have to create another section for confirming the password that the user enters while registering. So to do that, I'll just copy this, I'll press enter, I'll paste it, and instead of password I will call it confirmation, and similarly placeholder is going to be confirm password, and type is also going to be password. So that is pretty much it. But there's one other thing that we have to change, which is action. Right now it says login, which is copied from login, but here what we will do is we will open two double quotes and we will say URL underscore for, and then here I'll say register. This is going to be basically a variable which will be replaced with a /register. So this is done. The next thing we will do is we will go back to our app.py and we will work with /register. It will be towards the end. Okay, last second is register, right? So let me get rid of this for now. And the very first thing that we have to do is we have to clear the previous session. Like if the user was already logged in, we will want to clear it because the user is going to register, right? So let's add a comment and let's say clear previous session, press enter, and to clear the session we do session.clear. And then the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to check if the method was post or get. If the method was post, which basically means that the user is trying to register a new user, right? So in that case, if request.method is equals to post, in that case what we will do is we will verify that all the information that the user provides is accurate and valid. Let's just call it credentials. And the very first thing that we will check is whether or not all the values were entered, as in the username was entered, the password was entered, and the confirm password was entered. So I'll say if not request.form.get username. If this value is not provided, in that case what we will do is we will return an apology, apology, by saying username is needed or required, and the error code that we will send is 400. The next thing that we will check is elif not request.form.get password. If the password was not provided, we will basically do the same thing. I'll copy this entire thing and I'll say password is required and 400 error code also. Similarly, I'll just copy all of this, press enter, elif blah blah blah, and the name is confirmation, and then we'll say you must confirm your password. And finally, if the user has entered all of these values, we will check whether or not the password and the confirmation password is correct, or basically whether or not they match, because it has to match. So I'll say elif request.form.get password. If it's not equal to request.form.get confirmation, if they are not the same, in that case we will return apology again, and we will say passwords do not match and error code 400 again. And now let's say that all the values that the user entered is correct, is valid, and the passwords do match. What do we want to do next? We want to make sure that we are not creating duplicate users, right? So basically we will run a search through our database and we will try to find whether or not there are any existing users with the same username, right? Let's just add a comment first. We will say search database for username, and I'll create a new variable calling rows, and I'll say db.execute execute, and my SQL command is going to be select users from, how do I know it's going to be called users, is through here. If I say cd week 9 / finance ls, and here if I say SQLite 3 finance.db, and if I say .schema, we already have 3 tables here. One is users, another is this, and another is this command. We will need to create one more later, but for now we just know that there is a table called users which has id, username, has, cas, and a few other things, right? Which is why I know, or actually it's going to be select asterisk from users, which is our table, where username is equals to question mark, and question mark is basically our placeholder for SQL commands, and in place of the question mark what we want to send is request.form.get and username. Whatever this command returns will be stored inside rows. So what we want to do now is we want to check whether or not the user already exists. We'll say if len of rows is not equals to 0, which means that there is an existing user with the same name. If this is the case, we will basically return an error. So I'll say return apology, username already exists. Our error code is again going to be 400. And now let's say this did not happen. Let's say that rows returned nothing, which would mean that the len or the length of the rows is 0, right? In that case, we want to register the user. So I'll say we'll add a comment again, and actually let's also add a comment here, checking for duplicates. Here we want to add a comment of register new user or new valid user. So to register the user, what we will do is we'll say db.execute, we'll say insert into users this username and this has, which are basically the variables that are used inside the table. And for the values, we'll say values is going to be placeholders, question mark, comma, question mark. And for the values, let's do this, and then our first username value is going to be request.form.get username, and then our second variable, or basically in place of our second placeholder, second question mark, we will say we'll create a hash for the password as was described in the video, because we don't want to just directly store the password, right? So we'll say generate, and this is a function that is already given to us. If you go on top, this is called generate password hash. This is a function which is inside helpers.py, right? So we can just use it. So I'll say generate password underscore hash, and the value that we are going to provide it is again our password. So I'll say request.form.get and password is what we are providing, and that should be about it. Okay, once this is done, the next thing that we are going to do is if the user does register, we want to basically like automatically log them in, right? So to do that, first we'll need to search the database again. So I'll say search for the newly registered user, and this will also help us make sure that the user was successfully registered, because if this does not work, it means that something went wrong, right? So search for newly registered user, and the command that we're going to do is, again, we will use the rows variable, and I'll say db.execute. Actually, let me just copy and paste this. And now once we have run this command one more time, rows will have the basically the newly registered users or the newly registered user. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll create a new session for the user. So basically being logged in, create a new session for the user. We'll come here and we'll say session, and we'll use user ID as the value, and I'll say take rows that was returned in line 140 here and go inside it and use the ID to get the value and to create the session. And once all of this is done, we want to finally redirect the user to the home page, right? So I'll say redirect to home, or basically back to home. And here I will say redirect, or actually return redirect, my bad. And we want to return here to /. So all of this is if request.method was post. If it was not post, in that case we just want to return them to register.html, which is our .html file that we just created. else return render underscore template, and the file that we want to provide is register.html. okay, hopefully this works. If I save it and if I come here, reload, if I click on register, there we go, we have something to work with, which is amazing. Now if I were to try this, if I say admin, if I press enter, it will say to do, as in it will not work immediately because we have a lot more to do. But what we do know now is, whoops, log out. Okay, what we do know now is register is done, right? The next thing that we are going to work with is to quote, right? So the very first thing again we will do is inside templates we'll create a new file called quote.html, and now let me go to register.html and I'll copy all of this so that we don't have to keep typing everything, and I'll get rid of the form, and let me change this also. I'll say QUOTE, and inside the main HTML what we are going to do is we'll say let's create a S2 heading first, and we'll say get a stock quote, right? Once this is done, the next thing that we'll do is we'll create a new form for the user, which will allow the user to enter the symbol of the stock that they are trying to find the price for. So I'll say form action equals, and here again we will use double quotes, or basically double curly braces, and we'll say URL underscore for QUOTE. And once this is done, action is done, method that we will use is post. We are just trying to keep everything private so that the URL does not have the values that we are sending. So here we will create an input box, and we'll say type is going to be text, name we will say symbol, symbol, and we want to auto focus it. Placeholder similarly is going to be sym, and this, once this is done, the next thing that we will do is we will add a button, right? So I'll say button, type is going to be submit, and the name we will give it is get quote. Okay, this is done. But alongside this, what we also want to do is when the user is searching for a symbol perhaps, right below the form we also want to display the result, right? So basically if this .html or code.html file is called again, but it is provided certain value which is basically going to be our quote value, if that is the case, what I mean by that is here, if we have something called quote, in that case what we want to do is we want to render something here, right? Which is basically, we can say S3 perhaps, and we want to use a variable here to which we will say quote name. This will be the value that is provided, right, by the user when, or basically this is the value that is provided when we are calling this code.html. So we want to display the name of the thing, or basically name of the symbol, and then what we also want to do is we want to say, we want to show the name, and then inside this we also want to basically show the symbol, right? So I'll use another variable placeholder here, and I'll say quote, and I'll use the symbol here symbol. Once this is done, we are closing the bracket, and then we are going to show the price for it. So I'll go in the next line and I'll say paragraph tag the price of this particular name, or basically this particular stock. The price for it is again placeholder quote price, and this we want to render as USD. So this symbol that I used here is right beside the closing curly braces on the keyboard. So to show you is this is the key that I'm using. Okay, right below delete, or on the right of the closing curly braces, this is the key that I used. I typed shift and plus this, so that gave me a vertical line, and this will be important to basically convert the value of the price into USD. Okay, this is done, and then we also want to end if endif. So quote.html is done, but when we are doing this, we also want to make sure that we complete our part for app.py. So inside /quote, okay, here we go. Again, we will get rid of this for now, and we will again check if the method being used is post, which is if request.method equals to post. If this is the case, then we want to take the value that was given by the user, which is symbol, and that we will get by saying request.form.get symbol. Similarly, the quote is going to be request.form.get. Oh, actually no, because the user would only give us the symbol, right? Quote we would have to find out, and to find that out we will use a function called lookup, which is also imported here, right, from helpers. So we'll go back to the line where we were working, and we'll say quote lookup, and we will send us our file, or basically our symbol. And we will not need to put this in double bracket because it's a variable that we are sending, right? Symbol. And now let's say that the user entered a symbol which does not really exist, right? Which would mean will not receive any return value from lookup, right? So I'll say if not quote. If this is the case, it basically means it's an invalid thing, right? So I'll say return apology invalid symbol, and our return code again is going to be 400. On the other hand, if quote does exist, else return render template. In that case, we want to render our code.html, which we just created, and then the value that we want to provide for quote is again quote. And now if you go back to the HTML file that we created, you will see this from line 13 through line 16. This is the reason why we created it, so that when we do render our code.html, and if we do provide a quote value, it will be able to be used to render the return value. Okay, wonderful. And now all of this again is if the request method was post. What if that was not the case? In that case, what we will do is we will say else. We will just return render template, and the value we'll provide to this function is again code.html. Okay, this is good. It should work now. And now if I go here, oh, it will not work quite yet. Let's just complete everything first, and then we'll check what is working and what is not working. Okay, so we'll go back to our requirements. Quote is done. The next thing that we are going to do is buy, right? So what I'll do first is I'll copy everything from quote.html. I'll go to templates. I'll create a new file and call it buy.html. Press enter. I'll paste everything that I copied here, and I'll replace quote with buy. And here too, I'll say buy. Actually, I want to use a h1 for this page. This I want to say buy. Method is going to be post. This is good. And then I want to break the line. And then I want to use another input box for how many shares the user wants to buy. And I'll say name is going to be shares. Actually, for the buy page, let's also give this a ID just in case we might need to use it later. ID for this input box is going to be symbol, and the ID for here is going to be shares, same as the name. We want to get rid of autofocus because we can only autofocus in one, or we should only try to autofocus in one input box. Placeholder is going to be shares. So the second input box is also completed. I'll also break it one more time, and we want to change the name of the button, and I want to call it buy. And for this particular page, buy.html, we won't really need anything here. Cool. So buy.html is completed. The next thing we'll do is we'll go back to our app.py, and if you scroll up, you'll see in line 41 our route for buying, right? I'll get rid of this for now. And here again, the same thing, we will check whether or not the method that is being used is post, and if it is, we'll do a few things. If it's not, we'll do something else. So I'll say if request.method is equals to post. In this case, what we want to do is we want to say symbol is equals to request.form.get, and we'll say symbol. But what we also want to make sure is we are transforming the symbol that is provided by the user to all caps, or basically to uppercase, right? Because if the user enters everything in lowercase, it would not work. We just want to like make sure that the data that we are providing or data that we are using is valid and consistent. So I'll say dot upper, and this function will do the job. I'll just paste this thing, I'll get rid of upper, and here after symbol we will use shares. Here too I'll say shares, and once we have the symbol and shares, the next thing we will do is we just want to make sure that there actually is something called symbol and something called shares, which means if not symbol, basically if this is empty, in that case what we want to do is, again, we want to return apology. Symbol is required, and error code is again going to be 400. And now the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure the shares is valid, which would include 2 or 3 conditions. First would be whether or not it's empty. If the user does not enter any share values, apology. Similarly, if let's say the user enters a value that is not a number, it would be invalid. Similarly, if the user enters a negative value, it should be invalid, right? So I'll say if not shares or not shares dot is digit, which is a Python function. Finally, or not int shares, and if this value is less than or equals to 0, we should return apology. Return apology must be a positive number of shares, and the error code is again 400. The next thing we will do is we will look up for the value, right? So I'll say quote equals to lookup, and we will send it the symbol, and we will make sure that the symbol that the user entered does exist, right? So I'll say if quote is none, which means the lookup returned the value of none, basically does not exist. So I'll say return apology, symbol not found. I will actually also get rid of error codes from here because I don't want to throw a very hard error for by, right? Because all of this would happen like within the page. Okay, so I hope you have not skipped the video so far, otherwise errors will occur. The next thing I'll do is if this line is not executed, it means that the symbol, or basically the symbol is valid, right? So I'll say price is going to be quote, which is the value returned by lookup function, and the value is using price as the name. Similarly, total cost will be int shares that was given by the user, and then I'll multiply this with price, which was returned by the lookup function. Similarly, I'll say cas equals to db dot execute. I think I might need to bring back my terminal, so I'll say cd week 9 / finance, and I'll need to say sqlite3 finance.db.schema. So okay, let's go back here. So here I'll say db.execute, and the command that we are providing is select cas from. Cas is a value being used in our database. It's a variable. So select cas from users, where id is equals to colon user underscore id, close the double quotes. Now this is also a way to use a variable, right? Or basically it's kind of a placeholder, and the value for the colon user id is user underscore id equals session, and the value is user underscore id. Basically we are running this command for the user that is logged in, right? And how do we know that? We are using sessions, which is the exact thing that we used to log in the user after he or she registered, right? So that is good. Now db.execute, this is done. After we run this command, we will get a certain value, and then we don't want to store everything in cas, right? We want to take the first row, and then inside that we want to query for cas, which is the name of the value that will be returned, and it will be the value of cas. Now we also want to make sure that the user has enough cas to make the purchase, right? To make the transaction. So to ensure that, what I will do is I'll say if cas that the user has is less than total cost. In this case, what I want to do is I want to return another apology. return apology, you don't have enough gas, my friend. Okay, done. Now if this line is not executed, it would imply that the user has enough gas, and if he does, I basically want to go forward with the transaction. So I'll say db.execute. Now this will be a long line, so I'll add it in multiple lines, and I'll say update users, and I want to set gas equals to, and I want to reduce the value of gas that the user has because rest of the money is being used to make the purchase. So I'll say set gas equals gas minus variable total underscore gas, where id equals to another variable called user underscore id. I'll add a comma, I'll go to the next line. Now going into the next line doesn't really matter because when the program is actually run, it will consider everything as one line. And then for total gas, it's not total gas, it's total cost, right? Here too, total underscore cost is total cost, same here. And then also for user underscore id, session user underscore id. The next thing that I want to do is, let's add a comment. We want to update the history. Now this will come later because we also have to work on something called update, but for now let's just add this part so that we don't have to do it later. I'll say update history, and the code that we are going to write is db.execute. To maintain the history and everything else, we have to create a new database, or actually we have to create a new table inside database, right? And the command for that is going to be, if you are not inside finance.db, let me quit this, I'll show you from the beginning. So make sure that you navigate into week 9 finance. Finance is where we are, and finance is where we are solving the problem. And then if I do ls, we have a database called finance.db. So we will go into that database by saying sqlite3 space finance.db, press enter. Once you do that, if you do dot schema, this is the current structure of the database that you will see. After we have done this, what we need to do now to create a new table is this. We'll say create, I'll create a table and I'll call it transaction. Create table transactions, and I'll open bracket, I'll press enter. If I just press enter, it will take us to the new line, but all of this command that we are going to enter is going to be considered as the same command, same singular command, right? If we don't add a semicolon, it's the same line, it's the same command. So create table transactions, where id is going to be an integer value, integer, which we are going to use as primary key, and I want to auto increment it so that it goes from 1 to 2 to 3 automatically. Auto increment. I'll add a comma, press enter again. The next thing is user underscore id, and this also I want to be an integer, integer, and this cannot be null, not null. I'll add a comma, press enter again, and I'll say symbol, symbol, has to be a text, and this also cannot be null. Now symbol would be like AAPL for Apple, for example. Press enter again after the comma, and I'll say shares. Now shares will need to be an integer, and this also cannot be null, comma, press enter. Price has to be numeric, doesn't have to be an integer because the price could be something point something, right? It could be a floating value which is numeric, but it cannot be null, comma, press enter. Timestamp, which we will use to maintain the history, and I'll say date time default, and I'll use the current timestamp of when the transaction takes place, current underscore timestamp, comma, press enter again, and then I will create a foreign key, and foreign key is going to be user, I want it to be lowercase, user underscore id, references, users id. And now once this is done, I'll press enter again, and I'll close the bracket that I opened here, right? And I'll add a semicolon, I'll press enter. Make sure that you check this entire command whether or not you are entering the same command, because if you don't, you will get a lot of errors. Okay, and now if I were to say .schema, we have a new table here. Okay, cool. So we'll come back. Let me actually quit the terminal, and I'll come back to line 71, which is where we were updating the history. And now I can say, let me go to the new line, and I'll say insert into transaction, which is the table that we just created, TRANSCTIONS. Okay, spelling seems to be correct. Hopefully it is. And here I'll say, whoops, user underscore ID, comma, symbol, comma, says, comma, price, and then I'll put a space, and I'll say values for these variables is colon user underscore ID, comma, colon symbol, comma, colon shares, comma, colon price. And again, all of this is placeholder, right? So I'll close the double quotes, I'll do a comma, go to new line, and now I can say user underscore ID is going to be from session user underscore ID, and then I can add a comma here. I can now say symbol is equals to symbol because we already have this value. Similarly, says is also equals to says, and finally price is equals to price. Now we have updated the history here. Now once we have done this, we will also want to let the user know that the transaction has successfully occurred. So I'll use a function called flask, or actually flash. Make sure it's not flask, okay? Make it flash, FLASH. And I'll use a f string. I'll say bot says of symbol costing USD total underscore cost. And then once this message is flashed to the user, we will redirect them to /, and again I was about to make the same mistake. I want to redirect this. Now again, all of this was if the method was post, right? If that was not the case, I'll de-indent, and here I'll say else return render underscore template by.html. So we have, I think, also completed by.html. Now let's go back here. By is done, and now index. Okay, so that basically means we have to create a new HTML file, call it index.html, press enter. I'll just use login.html. I'll close this. I'll paste everything here, and here I will say portfolio, because this is index is going to be our portfolio. I want to get rid of all of this, and I want to start with a S2, and I'll say portfolio. Next line, I want to create a table so that all the shares held or owned by the user can be displayed in an organized manner, and I'll say table. I want to give us the class. Let's give it a few classes actually, because we are using Bootstrap under the hood. First class is table, next is table BORD, and the next class we can give is table striped. I'll close this, and inside table we want to first create the table head. Class is going to be thead, light would be nice. I'll close this, and I'll create a table row, and inside this we'll have table head again. th first can be symbol, the next could be name, says, price, total value. So thead is done. I'll open tbody now inside table again, tbody. I'll also want to close the tbody, and here I'll press enter, and inside tbody we will have to use a loop using Jinga, and I'll say for stock in stocks, which is going to be a value that we'll provide when we are rendering this file. I'll also end for immediately because I don't want to forget that. Now within this for loop, what I want to do is I want to say table row and table data, and the first data that we're going to use is going to be stock.symbol. Next thing is going to be stock.name, stocks.total share, stock.price, and we want to ensure that the price again entered by the user is in USD, stock.value. So this table row is done. We will also want to end the loop here, and then in the next line what I want to do within table body, I want to create another row, do this, and then table data, and then I want this to span for a few columns, call span 4, and then I want to align it to right, close it, and I'll call it cas, and then the value that I want to give is another variable, call it cas. Now it does show red here, but I think it'll work. I'll copy this, I'll paste it here again, and the next thing that I want to do is I want to say total value, and here I want to say total value. Let's add a space here too. Alright, seems like we are done with index.html. Wonderful. I'll close index.html and I'll go back to our app.py and I'll try to find index. It should be somewhere, definitely. Okay, we don't really have index dot, or basically a route for index, which is fine. Let's move on to the next part. If we come here, index is done. Next is cell, which again implies I have to create a new file. So first I'll go to by.html, I'll copy all of this, I'll go to templates, create a new file, and I'll say cell.html, press enter. I'll paste everything here, and I want to remove by, and I want to say cell says, and here I want to say cell says again. For the action, I want to change things here. I want to say cell method again is going to be post. Let's actually create these things from scratch, because we will have, or we will want to have different things here. So first I want to create a div within form, class equals to form group, and then I want to create a label for symbol, and I want to call it symbol also, and then I want to create a select menu, which will basically have all the sales that the user currently owns, right? Because we don't want the user to be able to sell something that they don't really own, right? So I'll say select class equals to form control, id equals to symbol, name also let's give symbol, and the option value, let's as of now not give anything, and I want to say select a stock. This is going to be the default value which the user will not be able to use. And then what I want to do is I want to copy this entire thing. Here I want to use a for loop to list all the shares that the user owns. So again, Zynga, I'll say for, and then I want to end for also, end for stock in stocks, and then I'll paste the line that I copied from here. Option value is going to be, let me remove the double quotes actually, and here I will say stock dot symbol, and then for the name here, instead of selector stock, I want to say stock dot name. This actually reminds me, we may have made a mistake earlier. If we go back to code.html, we did make a mistake. Let's copy all of this and let's move it here. Okay, this is a very interesting mistake. Anywho, do not make this mistake, fix it right now. So let's go back to cell.html, which is where we were working, and then stock name, and then I want to do open a bracket, close a bracket, and then I want to use another variable and call it stock.symbol. Okay, this is going to be our option, and then we will end for, and then we will end select, and we'll also end this div, but within this form we want to create another div, and we will give it the same class, form underscore group, or form hyphen group, and now we will create another input box, give it the class of form control. Next, the id is going to be says, the name is also going to be says, the placeholder is going to be number of says, the type of this particular input box is going to be number. I'll close this input box, and the div is also closed. And finally, after this div, we will create our submit button. Button type is equals to submit, and we'll call it cell. Let's also give it some styling. For that, we will say class equals to btn, and then btn hyphen primary, and this should get the work done. Okay, we have cell.html. Cool. Now we got the HTML working, or hopefully we did. Now let's go back to our app.py and scroll down until we come to cell, which is at the end. And now let's work on this. I'll get rid of this. I think cell is the next thing. Yeah. Wonderful. Now if somebody is trying to, or if the user is trying to sell something, sell a stock, we will need to first have access to the user's stocks that they have. So I'll say, let's add a comment. I'll say get users stocks, and I'll create a new variable called stocks, and I'll say db.execute. Let's go to a new line so that it's easier for you to see. I'll open double quote and I'll say select symbol, and then I'll use a function, SQL function called sum of says as total underscore says from transactions, which is the table that we created earlier to keep track of the history of all the transactions, from transactions where user underscore ID is equals to placeholder user underscore ID, and we'll give the value of the placeholder after we complete this SQL command. And then what we also want to do is we want to group this by symbol, and this should be having, or basically the details that we want to use to group all the symbols should have this, having total underscore says greater than 0. If it's less than 0, it's invalid. I'll say comma, press enter. Now actually let me do this so that you can see the entire command at once. I added a comma, I ended this command, and then in the next line I'm giving the value for the variables or the placeholder. User underscore ID is equals to session, and the value is user underscore ID. And now let's get back to the form, or basically the method, request method, right? If it is post, again like every other time, we'll say if request dot method is post double equals, not a single equals. If this is the case, we want to get access to symbol, and I want to say request dot form dot get symbol, and then again here I want to say says, and now we want to make sure that the user did actually enter a value. So I'll say if not symbol, we want to return apology, symbol is required. Here we want to say symbol dot upper. Let me just make sure that I have done dot upper everywhere. I'll paste this command, dot upper. Ooh, says dot upper. This was 147 inside quote. Make sure it's dot upper. This is how we avoid a lot of stress. Wonderful. Now if symbol is not entered, we'll say symbol is required. Similarly, we'll say elif, just like earlier, if not says or not says dot is digit, or if int of says is less than equals to 0. In this case, what I want to do is I want to say return apology must be a positive number of says, and if none of these lines are executed, then I want to say else says is equals to int says. Now in the next line I will say outside this if then thing, I want to say for stock in stocks, I want to run through all of the stocks, and I want to say if the current stocks symbol is equals to the symbol that the user wants to sell. If it is equals to the symbol that the user wants to sell, in that case what we want to first make sure of is the user is not selling more than the shares that he or she owns. So I want to say if stock total underscore shares is less than the shares that the user is trying to sell. If this is the case, I want to return an apology. You do not have enough shares, my friend. Okay, cool. If this is not the case, which means transaction can go ahead or the transaction can be executed. So I want to say quote equals lookup. I want to look for the symbol that the user entered, and I want to say if quote is none, as in if the lookup returns none, I want to return an apology, and I want to say symbol not found. If that does not happen, I want to say price equals quote price. Similarly, total underscore sale equals says times price. And now once this is done, still inside the else clause, I want to add another comment, and I want to update the user, update user, and I want to say db.execute let me add a new line, and here we'll say update users and set cas equals cas plus placeholder total underscore sale, where id equals placeholder user underscore id, double quotes closed, comma, and then for the placeholders we are saying total underscore sale is equals to total underscore sale user underscore id is equals to session user underscore id. Okay, there we go. We updated the user, and now what we also want to do is we want to basically update the history. So I'll say update history. I'll say db.execute insert into transactions, which is the table that we created earlier. Insert into transactions user underscore id, comma, symbol, comma, says, comma, price, and for the values I want to use placeholder user underscore id, comma, colon, symbol, colon, says actually, and then colon, price, and I'll close the double quotes, comma, next line, and then I want to provide value for all the placeholders that we are using. So I'll say user underscore id is equals to session user underscore id, the comma, next line, and then symbol is going to be symbol, says is going to be says, price is going to be price. Ooh, actually for says I want to pass in minus says because I want to reduce the number of says that the user has. Very interesting, do not forget this. Alright, so once this is done, I want to let the user know that the transaction has completed, or the transaction has been completed successfully. So I'll say flash, not flask, flash, and I want to use a f string. I want to say f sold says of symbol for USD total underscore sale exclamation mark and this, and then I will redirect the user to the homepage, and again return redirect. Now all of this will happen inside this for loop, right? And if everything happens properly, the user will be returned or the user will be redirected, right? However, if that does not happen, in that case what I want to do is let's make sure that this is indented properly. If this does not happen properly, what I want to do is I want to return apology. Return apology, symbol was not found, and I'll enter into the next line. I'll de-indent one more time and I'll say else. Now if you want to make sure that you're in the right indentation, if you indent all the way back to the beginning of the line, and if you do one tab, this is for else, and if you were to do two tabs, it will be for this return, right? Now else, what I want to do is I want to say return, and now this else is for our post, right? Or basically request method. If it is post, these things will happen. However, if it is not post, else, this is going to happen. Render underscore template cell.html. But also I want to pass it the stocks, right? Because if you remember when we created cell.html, we used a for stock in stocks Jenga loop, right? So I'll go back here and I'll pass it the stocks. I'll say stocks equals stocks. All right, very well. So cell is done, and now we are going to work on history, and that should be hopefully the last major part. Also it's to do. This was the index part that we missed earlier. Okay, let's complete this first, and after we have completed index, then we will move on to history, right? So inside index, let's get rid of this. Index basically is our portfolio. So I'll first get the value of the user's stocks, or the number and the value of stocks that the user has. So again, I'll say get users stocks and says, and I'll say stocks equals to db.execute new line. Let's say select symbol, comma, sum of says as total underscore says from transactions, which is the table that we created earlier, where user underscore id is equals to placeholder again user underscore id, and then we want to group this by, group by symbol, but we want to filter it, so I'll say having total underscore says greater than 0, double quotes, comma, new line. And now we only used one placeholder, user ID, so I'll say user underscore ID equals session, and here I'll say user underscore ID. Okay, next line. Then I want to get the users gas. I'll say get users gas balance. I'll say gas equals db.execute again. This problem set is tiring. Select gas from users, where id equals to placeholder user underscore id, and I'll say user underscore id is equals to session user underscore id, but also 0 gas, because gas is the value that I want to use and store inside gas. Next line, I'll say total underscore or total value equals to gas. Also grand total for now is gas, and now we will update the values. So I'll say find total values for stock in stocks. I want to say quote is equals to lookup. I want to pass it stock of symbol, and stock name I want to say, or basically I want to assign quote name. Next line, the stock's price is going to be quote price, and then again I want to say value, and I want to provide it the value of quote price times stock total underscore says. Next line, finally total underscore value. I want to add to the existing value that it already has the stock's value, and then grand total also plus equals value. All right, so we have found the totals of everything. The next thing that we will do is we will render template. We will return render template, render underscore template index.html, and I want to pass it the value stocks is equals to stocks. Similarly, I also want to pass it gas is equals to USD of gas. Similarly, total underscore value is equals to USD total underscore value, comma, grand underscore total is equals to grand underscore total. We're using USD converter only for gas and total value, not for grand total. All right, so we got this, which is great. Now let's go back to the problem that we were solving, which is history, right? Okay, 109. Now since we have a history problem, we will need another template. So I'll copy everything from cell, and now let me get rid of this. I'll create a new file and I'll call it history.html. Press enter. I'll paste everything that I copied, and then I'll change this cell size to history, and I'll get rid of all of this, get rid of this and the h1, so it's say history, and here I'll create a table which will contain all the history values, or basically the history of all the transactions that have been executed by the user. All right, so I'll say table, let's give it a class table, and table striped, and here I want to say t head. I'll create a table row which is going to be our table heads row, and I'll give it a few table head values th. I'll say type, and the next thing I'll say symbol says price total timestamp, because since it's history it has to have the value of when the transaction had taken place. And now after table head I'll say t body, and I'll now use a for loop to loop through all the history values and list it in the table. So I'll again use Jinga for that, for transaction in transactions, and for, now I'll say table row, now I'll say table data, now open and close double quotes, double curly bracket, and I'll say transaction dot type, similarly transaction dot symbol, similarly transaction dot says, similarly transaction dot price, and I want to wrap this in a bracket, and I want to say USD, copy this again, and here I want to say transaction dot price times transaction dot says, and this will be our total transaction dot timestamp. Okay, once this is done, I'm ending for app.py. Let's go back, and now let's fix this, or let's complete the route for history. This I think should be comparatively easier. So the very first thing that we'll do is we'll say transactions is equals to db.execute, and I want to actually let's do everything in a new line. So I'll open a double quote and I'll say select asterisk from transactions where user underscore id is equals to placeholder user underscore id, but order it by timestamp in descending order because we want the latest transaction that took place to be on top. And I'll add a comma, and user underscore id is going to be again session user underscore id. All right, and after this transaction equals db execute, we'll do another thing, and we'll simply return render underscore template history.html that we just created, and we'll also pass the values of transaction equals to tran okay. Ooh, this is the mistake that I made. If not this, I'll have to get rid of the not. This was a close call. Let me open a new terminal here and I'll navigate into our folder. Now let's go back to our requirements. I'll come down. Let's just use check50 to make sure everything else is correct. I'll paste the check50 command and let's see. Everything here is correct. Wonderful. Oh, we already did this when we were implementing the index file. We already added the select menu, and that allows the user to, just select what they want to sell. So if we go to sell, they can select it here. They don't have to type the symbol. So this is done. So we already have a personal touch, right? Let's see if we can submit and get a full point. Let me copy all of this submit code, and let's run style50 also. Style50 app.py. So here I'll say style50 app.py, press enter, filter connect extension to blah 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 blah. Okay, fine, I'll just paste the submit code. Keeping in mind the program's academic honesty policy, yes, I'm sure to submit it, press enter, go here to see your score, and there we go. Check50 gave us 21/21 and style50 gave us 0.93, which is totally fine. So finance is done. So dear friends, this is how you complete the finance problem, which is the final problem set of CS50 of week 9. The end final project is going to be a different thing. I'm going to make a video about that also. But if this video has been helpful, if this entire playlist that we have built has been helpful, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment down below. That does immensely help. This video took me like over 2 hours to make, right? Because I didn't include everything. Anywho, these videos have taken a lot of time and effort to make, so any support that you show to the channel will be highly appreciated. I will see you for the final video of the final project of CS50 in the next video. So subscribe to the channel for that. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.